Hey there, everybody, and thanks for joining me. In this lesson, I want to talk to you at a very high level about Azure Public and Private Services. So, we'll firstly talk about Azure services in general, and then we'll talk about how if you're using the Microsoft Public Cloud, you can still access services privately and some that are built for public accessibility as well. So, when we think about using Microsoft Azure, we might, for example, be building a web store, for example, the Aussiemart web store. Now, that might be a web application that allows people to purchase goods. We have users all across the globe that access that. And if we're using Azure, we might actually use more than one service to provide that functionality to our end users. For example, we could use Azure App Service, load balancers, and blob storage. Now, right now, it's not important what each of these services are. The key point is that there are lots of different services available with Microsoft Azure, and they can help us out for a range of different scenarios. So these are just some services we might use if we are building a web store, but there are many, many more. And really, remember the key point about cloud here is that we can use those services for a specific intention, but we don't have to worry about things that happen behind the scenes. So the underlying hosting infrastructure, storage, networking, and maybe even software for some of these different services. Now, when we're using Microsoft Azure, there are lots and lots of different services that are available to us, depending on the different types of things we are trying to achieve. We've got security services, identity, storage, things for hosting containerized solutions, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and just so much more. Now, again, we're not focusing on what each of these services are because there's really a lot of them, and we're going to cover these in greater detail in different courses. But the thing to bear in mind here is that if you are using Microsoft Azure or even Amazon AWS or Google GCP, there's lots of different services you can use. And you're going to see that typically they provide different types of functionality for different purposes, and they even provide different levels of control. So for example, we might use virtual machines, a service that allows us to run up servers in the cloud, things like Windows servers or Linux servers. And if we use that service, we've got a fair bit of control over the underlying operating system, what applications we install, what data we deploy, and so on. Whereas if we use some other services, like Azure App Service, we don't actually get access to the operating system, and that means that we get less control, but it's easier for us to manage. So whatever cloud provider you're using, you're going to see there are a range of different servers that cover these different disciplines, and they also cover varying levels of control. Now also, when you work with Microsoft Azure, since you've got a range of different services you might be working with, you'll find that there's lots of different billing models that you can use as well. So if we're running up some servers in the cloud, we might need to pay for the CPU and the memory that we are using on a per hour basis, for example. But if we are just using a storage service, maybe just for storing images and files, then we might only actually pay per gigabyte, and we might even pay for the number of requests that we receive to access that data. Or if we're using some sort of Microsoft Software as a Service solution, SaaS, then we might actually only pay per user. So when you use Microsoft Azure, you'll come to learn that there are lots of different building blocks that we can use together depending on the thing that we are working with, the amount of control that we want, and that'll also influence the way in which that service is built. Now, Microsoft Azure is a public cloud provider. That means that anyone pretty much anywhere in the world can go and access these full suite of services. But that doesn't mean that these always have to be publicly available. So let's say, for example, you've got some users who are based on premises, and maybe you've got some services online, Gmail, Outlook, or maybe even some media streaming services. Now, generally, when we use these solutions online, they are directly available to our users through the internet. Now, again, even though Azure is a public cloud provider, that doesn't mean that the services that you build have to be publicly available. So you can, in fact, go and deploy some services that are only accessible privately. For example, Kubernetes, which is a container hosting service, can be deployed to a private network in Azure that only you can get access to. Maybe you're going to have some virtual machines in there for Windows or Linux servers, and you might even set it up so that those servers can access your Kubernetes containers. Now, the thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that even though Azure is a public cloud provider, it doesn't mean that all of the things that you deploy have to be publicly accessible. So, for example, these services might not actually be accessible from your users on premises or maybe even anyone out on the internet. And in fact, it might even be that those services just talk to one another within your private networking space in your Azure public cloud. So you can have services that are set up to block all external access and only allowed internal private access. Now, yes, there definitely are ways that you can overcome this. You can use things like virtual private networking to allow your on-premises network to privately access your private resources in Microsoft Azure. And we could also even configure public access as well. In fact, when we do work with Microsoft Azure, there are various services that are built for public accessibility as well. So we might, for example, go and deploy a service called Blob Storage, which allows us to easily host images, files, documents, and other sorts of media assets that you want to be publicly accessible. We might also use Azure App Service, which allows us to host web applications as well. Now, these services and many other services are built for public accessibility. This does mean that whether your users are on premises or somewhere out on the internet, that these services can be accessed publicly over the public internet. Now, yes, we can of course secure these using features like firewalls and access controls and other things as well. But the key point here is that there are many different services in Microsoft Azure that are built for public accessibility by default. And when you deploy them, unless you go and turn on some firewalls or other security features, they will be accessible to users via the public internet. Whereas you have these other services that are built for private accessibility only. Now, yes, there are a range of ways that we can actually go and change this configuration. So, for example, we might create public IP addresses for our virtual machines to allow public accessibility. So, folks, the key point here to understand is that when you are working with Microsoft Azure, yes, it is a public cloud provider available to a range of different people all across the globe. But depending on the services that you go to use within Microsoft Azure, you're going to come to learn that some of them are built for public accessibility and some of them are built for private accessibility. And we have a range of different features and tools available to us to change the way in which this type of connectivity does work. So everybody, that's a quick walkthrough of Azure public and private services. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you again soon.